The CAGED system for guitar is a way of organising the fretboard into 5 positions. Every chord, scale, arpeggio and so on can be placed into each one of these 5 positions. This prevents your fretboard looking like this and turns it into something much more like this. For this reason, I like to think of the CAGED system as a filing cabinet for everything you ever learn on guitar. Be sure to watch to the very end of this lesson to fully understand this concept, and remember to give a like below and comment if you learned something today. Let me show you how this works. The name CAGED is taken from the open chords C, A, G, E and D that every guitar player knows. Each one of these chords will suggest a different position on the fretboard. In CAGED, however, I prefer to think of the E chord as our starting position, as this will help tie in with how scales fit in with each position at a later stage. So we need to do some rearranging. CAGED is a more accurate representation of the CAGED system, as now the chord shapes are ordered correctly. It just doesn't quite roll off the tongue the same as CAGED does. Now let's use these chord shapes to map out our 5 positions on the fretboard. To do this, I'm going to show you how to play a G chord in 5 different locations across the neck. Starting with our E shape. To form a G chord using an E shape, we simply need to play a G bar chord starting from the 3rd fret of the low E string, or G note. This works because we have taken an E shape along with all the open strings and raised it up until we arrive at G. If you already know how to play a bar chord using an E shape, then this one should be pretty straightforward. This gives us our first way of playing a G chord using the CAGED system. We simply just reference the G root note and place the E shape on top. Next, we're using a D shape to form a G chord, which would look like this. So once again, we've taken our open D shape and raised it up, including the open D string, until we arrive at G. A quicker way of working this out, however, is to simply find the G note on the D string and attach the correct shape to it, or simply see how it attaches to our previous chord shape. Now we're going to form a G chord using an open C shape, which would look like this. Once again, all we've done is moved an open C shape up until we arrive at a G. To quickly place this chord down, simply find a G note on the A string, as this is where the root note of our C shape is found, and attach the correct shape. Or you could also see how this attaches itself to our previous chords. The 4th way of forming a G chord will be using an open A shape, which would look like this. If you're already well acquainted with bar chords, then this will look very familiar. Once again, this is simply an A chord that has been raised up, including all the open notes, to form a G. The quickest way to form this shape is to find a G note on the A string and attach the correct shape to it, or simply see how it attaches to our previous shapes. Take note that the root note from the C form chord and the A form chord is the same. The final position uses an open G chord to form a G chord, so if you were simply to play an open G chord at this stage, you would be absolutely correct. However, this really only applies to the key of G, and we need a way of playing this using a bar so that it can be used in any other key. For this, we need to visualize this chord played an octave higher. We would do this by referencing our G note on the low E string, and finding the same note 1 octave up on the same string, which would look like this. And let's not forget about the bar. Now, although this is correct, it doesn't make for an easily playable chord, and for this reason, we're going to remove a few notes. The shape you are looking at now is a common way of playing the final chord using our CAGED system. To find this chord quickly, rather than looking for the G root note on the low E string, as this is where the root note of our open G is located, look to the high E string, as this is also a G note, and then simply attach our G CAGED shape to this note instead. Let's look at how all 5 shapes connect together and join back up again after the final position. You should view these 5 CAGED shapes less like this and more like this, as the whole system repeats itself. You should practice playing all 5 chords in sequence to begin with to become fully acquainted with each position, which would sound like this. After this, start the whole sequence from a different starting note, like A for instance. In future lessons, I'll talk about how this applies to different chord shapes and scales, but this is a good starting point in working out how the fretboard is broken up into 5 positions. Let's talk about how minor chords fit into the CAGED system for guitar. To demonstrate each minor chord in the CAGED system for guitar, we will look at the 5 positions of major chords learnt in the previous lesson and make a small adjustment to each shape. This method makes learning 5 new shapes easy to digest. A quick reminder here that although the CAGED system is built from the open chords C, A, G, E and D, and each one of these suggests a different position on the fretboard, I prefer to think of the E chord as our starting position, as this will help tie in with how scales fit within each position at a later stage. So we need to do some rearranging. CAGED is a more accurate representation of the CAGED system, as now the chord shapes are ordered correctly. It just doesn't quite roll off the tongue the same as CAGED does. Let's begin by learning how to play a G minor chord in 5 positions, starting with the E shape. To form a G minor chord using an E shape, we simply need to refer to our first major shape learnt in the previous CAGED lesson, which looked like this. We now need to lower one note, in this case the B note on the 4th fret of the G string. We would call this note the major third. Let's lower this note by 1 fret, revealing the minor third, which is now played by the bar on the 3rd fret. This should be a very familiar shape to most of you. This is also the same as if you were to change from an open E chord to an E minor by removing your 2nd finger. Next, we're using our D shape, learnt in the previous CAGED lesson, to form a G minor chord. To do this, lower the major third, in this case the B note located on the 7th fret of the high E string, by 1 fret. You will need to rearrange your fingers to accommodate this new shape. This once again is the same as if you were to change from an open D chord to a D minor chord. Now we're using our C CAGED shape, learnt from the previous lesson, to form a G minor chord. To do this, we need to lower the major third, in this case the B note located on the 9th fret of the D string, by 1 fret, and remove our bar. Once again, it's necessary to rearrange your fingers to accommodate this shape. Now this shape isn't much fun to play and can be difficult for a lot of guitarists, so a common thing to do is move our 4th finger to the high E string for a nicer sounding and easier to play voicing. Alternatively, just remove this note altogether for an easy to play shape that works especially well in a band scenario. Next, we're going to be making a G minor chord using our A CAGED shape. To make this major shape minor, we simply need to lower the major third, in this case the B note located on the 12th fret of the B string, to the minor third 1 fret lower. This is the same as if you were to change from an open A chord to an A minor chord. And to form a G minor chord using our G CAGED shape, let's take a closer look at the previously learnt major CAGED shape. Lowering the major third in this chord isn't an option, as it wouldn't make for a very practical chord to play, but we can find the minor third note in a different location, in this case the 15th fret of the G string, but this leaves us with both a major third and a minor third in the same chord. The answer to this problem is to replace the major third of this chord with the D note on the 15th fret of the B string. You can play this with just 2 fingers, as we can now bar all 3 notes on the 15th fret. And remember, to quickly reference this chord, you simply need to find the root note, or G, which would be on the high E string, and apply the minor CAGED shape. You should practice all 5 chords in sequence to begin with to become fully acquainted with each position. You could also play both the major and minor version of each chord in sequence to help visualize the relationship between each shape. And of course, when you can do this, start the whole sequence from a different starting note, like A for instance, to really establish this into your playing. In this lesson, I will show you how to play a major 7 chord in 5 positions, which will give you standard major chords and much more sophisticated and jazzy quality. To keep things simple, every example in this lesson will be played in the key of G. However, once you've learnt each shape, it's very easy to shift each chord to any key by simply starting on a different root note. Let's start with position 1 of G major 7, which is based around the E shape. As a major 7 chord is built from the root, 3rd, 5th and 7th degrees of the major scale, a common way of arranging this in position 1 is to play the root on the low E string, followed by the 7th on the D string, the 3rd on the G string and the 5th on the B string, which would sound like this. Notice how the major 7 interval is always 1 fret or semitone below the root note, or G note in this case, as this will help with learning the remaining 4 shapes quickly. Now I'll show you the ideal fingering for this chord. For the remaining 4 shapes in this lesson, I will simply just show you the fingering for each chord, rather than the individual intervals that make up each chord. Next, we will be learning position 2 of G major 7 by referencing our position 2 major chord, which used our D shape. All you need to do to change this major chord into a major 7 chord is lower the root note, or G, by 1 fret. We have 2 G notes in this chord, so let's pick the higher note to keep the G in the bass. You can play this chord with just 2 fingers, as the notes on the 7th fret can be barred. That would sound like this. Next up is position 3 of G major 7, and we will be referencing our position 3 major chord, which used our C shape. As with the last shape, there are 2 root notes, or G notes, present in the chord. And again, we're going to pick the higher of the 2. In this case, the G note on the 8th fret of the B string, and lower it by 1 fret to reveal the major 7 interval. This would sound like this. To play position 4 of G major 7, we will be referencing our position 4 major chord, which used our A shape. Once again, we have two root notes, or G notes, present in the chord, and once again we will choose the higher of the two to lower by 1 fret, revealing the major 7th interval, which would sound like this. Be sure to give this video a like or comment below if you're learning something today, but let's move on. To play position 5 of G major 7, we will be referencing our position 5 major chord, which used our G shape. In this chord, we have two G notes once again, and all we need to do is lower the higher of the two by 1 fret, giving us this very easy to play G major 7 chord. You should play all these chords in sequence to become fully acquainted with each position, and then start the whole sequence from a different starting note, like A for instance, to get used to playing these shapes in different keys. In this lesson I will show you how to play a dominant 7th or just 7th chord in 5 positions, using the CAGED system for guitar. This will give your standard chords a more bluesy quality. To keep things simple, every example in this lesson will be played in the key of G. However, once you've learnt each shape, it's very easy to shift each chord to any key by simply starting on a different root note. Let's start with position 1 of G7, which will use our E shape. If you're familiar with your standard open 7th chords, then this process will be very easy. All you need to do is place your bar down starting from a G root note and then drop an E7 shape on top. This is the same as if you were to shift an E7 chord up, including all the open notes, until you arrived at the correct root note, in this case, G. This is position 1 of G7, however most guitar players tend to remove these two notes, giving us this very easy to play G7th chord, which would sound like this. Next, we will be learning position 2 of G7 by using our D shape. To visualize this chord, all you need to do is move an open D7 shape up, including the open D string, until we arrive at the G root note. Although once you know this, it's far quicker to simply find the correct root note, in this case G, and then place the D7 shape on top. This would give us position 2 of G7 using the CAGED system, which would sound like this. Next up is position 3 of G7, which will use our C shape. This one is very easy, as all you need to do is play a traditional open C7 chord and shift it up until we arrive at the G root note. If you want to play this chord quickly, however, just visualize the desired root note, in this case G, and attach the correct shape on top, giving us position 3 of G7 using the CAGED system, which would sound like this. Be sure to give this video a like or comment below if you're learning something today, but let's move on. Next up is position 4 of G7, which uses our A shape. To play this chord, we simply need to visualize an open A7 chord and shift it up, including all the open strings, until we reach our G root note. Once again, you should visualize your G root note and place the correct shape on top to access this chord quickly. This would sound like this. And finally, position 5 of G7, which will use our G shape. In order to play this chord, we first need to visualize an open G7 chord. We can now shift this shape up, including the open strings, until we arrive at the G root note. However, this time we're going to remove the notes on the low E and A strings to make it much easier and nicer to play voicing, which would sound like this. You should play all these chords in sequence to become fully acquainted with each position, and then start the whole sequence from a different starting note, like A for instance, to get used to playing these shapes in different keys. In this lesson, I will show you how to play a minor 7th chord in 5 positions using the CAGED system for guitar. This will give your minor chords much more of a jazzy quality. Every example in this lesson will be played in the key of G. However, once you've learnt each shape, it's very easy to shift each chord to any key by simply starting on a different root note. Let's start with position 1 of G minor 7, which will use our E shape. As a minor 7th chord is built from the root, flat 3rd, 5th and flat 7th degrees of the major scale, a common way of arranging this in position 1 is to play the root note on the low E string, followed by the 7th on the D string, the 3rd on the G string, and the 5th on the B string, and then simply lower the 3rd and 7th by 1 semitone or fret, revealing the minor 3rd and minor 7th. Now you might be tempted to play this chord using all 4 fingers, like this, but a much more common and useful way of approaching this shape is to fret the root note, which in this case is a G, with your 2nd finger, and bar the remaining notes with your third finger, giving us this very easy to play G minor 7 chord, which would sound like this. Next, we will be learning position 2 of G minor 7, which will use our D shape. To visualize this chord, begin by placing down the G root note on the D string, using your first finger, followed by your second finger on the B string 6th fret, your third finger on the high E string 6th fret, and finally your fourth finger on the G string 7th fret. This would give us position 2 of G minor 7, which would sound like this. Next up is position 3 of G minor 7, which will be using our C shape. To visualize this chord, start by placing down the G root note on the A string 10th fret, using your third finger, followed by your fourth finger on the G string 10th fret, and finally a bar across the D, G and B strings, using your first finger. And be careful not to bar the high E string, as we don't want to include this note in our chord. This would give us position 3 of G minor 7, which would sound like this. Be sure to give this video a like or comment below if you're enjoying this lesson and wish to see future content. But let's move on. Next up is position 4 of G minor 7, which will be using our A shape. This one should be very familiar to you, as it's similar to a standard minor bar chord starting from the A string root note. To visualize and play this shape, start by finding the G root note on the A string. This is the same root note used for our position 3 chord shape, and place a bar down using our first finger. From here, place your third finger on the D string 12th fret, and your second finger on the B string 11th fret. Or you could simply see this as a 5-string minor bar chord shape without the fourth finger. This would give us position 4 of G minor 7, which would sound like this. And finally, position 5 of G minor 7, which will use our G shape. In order to play this shape, you first need to visualize a G root note on the low E string. However, we won't actually be playing this note. Instead, we will use this more as a reference note to know where to place the remaining notes of the chord. From the root note, you need to jump to the A string and then find the note that is 2 frets or semitones down. Play this note with your second finger, followed by the first finger on the G string 12th fret, third finger on the high E string 13th fret, and your fourth finger on the B string 15th fret, which would sound like this. This shape can be a struggle for many guitarists and isn't used too often, so don't worry about spending too much time on this one, but I would still recommend trying it out, as you never know when it might come in handy in the future. You should play all these chords in sequence to become fully acquainted with each position, and then start the whole sequence from a different starting note, like A for instance, to get used to playing these shapes in different keys. In my first lesson on the CAGED system for guitar, I said that the CAGED system is like a filing cabinet for everything you ever learn on guitar. So in this lesson, I would like to expand on this concept and introduce you to CAGED Pentatonics. So if you're new to mixing rhythm and solo guitar or lead guitar, this lesson will give you everything you need to get started. Let's start with an overview of how the system works, after which I will break down each position in more detail. Take this opportunity to pause, grab a guitar and perhaps a cup of coffee, and while you're at it, I would be grateful if you could tap the like button. Right, let's get started. The idea of CAGED pentatonics is simple. You have 5 positions of major and minor pentatonics and 5 positions of major and minor chords. These overlap with each other, which means wherever you place your hand on the fretboard, you will always have access to a chord and a pentatonic scale that work together from one of these 5 CAGED positions. For example, position 1 of the minor pentatonic scale overlaps with our position 1 minor CAGED chord. Position 2 overlaps with position 2, 3 with 3, 4 with 4, and 5 with 5. This system allows you to file away chord shapes and scales together into any one of our 5 positions. This is a concept you'll be able to use more and more as you learn new positions of chords, scales, arpeggios, and modes. But as the main focus of this lesson will be helping you to visualize and glue chords and pentatonics together, allowing you to go between rhythm guitar and lead guitar seamlessly, let's get into each position in more detail. And as the most common caged positions used by guitarists tend to be positions 1 and 4, this is what we will be looking at today. I will begin by showing you exactly how to do this with both major and minor chords and their corresponding pentatonic positions, starting with position 1 minor chords. Here is position 1 of the minor pentatonic scale, and here is the first minor caged shape. Notice how the chord shape fits nicely within the scale and that they share the same root notes, in this case A. Once you can visualize this relationship, you can do a few things. One being that you can target specific notes of the chords within your solos other than the root to really highlight the sound of the chords you're improvising over. For example, you could target the minor third or the fifth of the chord. Another being that you could blend pentatonics and chords together to create a hybrid rhythm lead style similar to what you might expect to hear from either John Frusciante or Jimi Hendrix. A really useful and hands-on way of practicing the connection between caged chords and pentatonic scales is to play one measure or 4 beats worth of a rhythm using the chord, and then 4 beats of lead using the corresponding pentatonic scale. Groove and timing are important here, so try and keep it simple at first if you struggle with this concept. Here's an example. Now let's look at how we would approach a standard position 1 major chord in the CAGED system. As this is a position 1 major chord, you will need to play position 1 of the major pentatonic scale over this. As you can see, this shape fits perfectly within the scale, allowing you to weave pentatonic fills around your chord and target specific chord tones. As I mentioned previously, that this lesson will be covering positions 1 and 4 of both major and minor chords and their respective pentatonic patterns. We will now move on to position 4. But be sure to watch to the very end where I will show you how to play through a full chord progression using just what we've learnt within this lesson. Here is position 4 of the minor pentatonic scale, and here is the 4th minor caged shape. Notice that once again the chord shape fits nicely within the scale and that they share the same root notes. Your job is to try and visualize the chord within the pentatonic scale when playing lead to target notes within the chord, and vice versa. If you're playing a chord, try to visualize the pentatonic scale so that you have the option of playing in and around the chord shape when playing rhythm guitar. Here is position 4 of the major pentatonic scale, and here is position 4 of a major caged chord. The chord shape fits within the scale perfectly, giving you lots of options for chord tone targeting and playing fills in and around the chord. You will quite often see guitarists play this chord with a bar using either the 3rd or 4th finger. The most common reasons being that it's much more comfortable and easier to play, but also that it frees up a couple of fingers, which is ideal when you're going between rhythm and lead or a mix of the two. Something that is also worth mentioning at this stage is that when using pentatonics over chords in a Hendrix Frusciante style, you don't need to stay strictly within the pentatonic pattern that fits with a chord. If you already know your 5 pentatonic scale positions and how they fit together, then you can slip in and out of the positions either side of the chord quite easily without getting too far away from the chord you intend to return to. A good example of this can be seen when playing over our position 4 or A-shape major chord. You will frequently see guitarists use the next pentatonic position up or down from the chord to give more range and movement. Here's an example. Okay, so now we know which pentatonic positions fit over the 4 most common chord grips within the CAGED system. We can put this to use using a chord progression. For this, I will use a very standard 1-5-6-4 progression in the key of G. So that would be G, D, E minor, and C. The first time through the progression, I will use a G in 1st position, a D in 4th position, an E minor in 4th position, and a C in 1st position. And the second time through, I will use a G in 4th position, a D in 1st position, E minor in first position, and finally C in first position before resolving back to our first position G chord where we started. I'll keep things relatively simple so you can follow along easily. Give this example a listen and then try it out for yourself. Once you have this concept down and want to take it to the next level, you may want to use positions 2, 3 and 5 of the minor or major pentatonic scale and each corresponding caged chord. The advantage in this is that you will have more options for voicings of different chords, and you will be able to play over any chord progression without ever shifting position on the neck, which will really put your caged guitar knowledge to the test. For example, to play over our 1-5-6-4 progression, so G, D, E minor and C in one fretboard location, we could start with a G first position, D third position, E minor second position and C fourth position, and the corresponding pentatonic shapes would match. So over G position 1 you would use G major pentatonic position 1, over D position 3 you would play D major pentatonic position 3, over E minor position 2 you would use minor pentatonic position 2, and finally over C position 4 you would use C major pentatonic position 4. If you want to see more lessons like this, then feel free to browse my channel, and don't forget to like and leave a comment. See you in the next one.